Chain loose on his left, the floor officer said. I crouched, slid 2 fingers under the restraint collar on the inmate's wrist, and found the half-click. Set it. The officer tightened the seal. The inmate watched me with a hard little smile, as if we were sharing a private joke. His name was Jackson Granger. Freight sabotage, passenger liner attached, 411 dead by the closed count. He had come into Mercy Wing broad-shouldered and loud in intake. Sentence time took the volume out of men. It always did. They got smaller near the end, even before the gate. The station liked to call that acceptance. Mostly, it was exhaustion. Behind him, the shaft dropped away under the rail into a darkness so deep the lights failed before the eye did. Mercy Wing wrapped that void in white steel, polished deck and legal language. Transit rails ringed the walls. Lift spines climbed and vanished. Shield housings sat in clean, recessed lines. The gates waited in their frames like instruments laid out for surgery. The first thing every new officer learned was to keep his eyes on the condemned and off the drop. The second was how to talk about the work without naming it. Sentence execution became release. The body became closure material. Time became compression depth. We told ourselves the courts had already done the hard part, and maybe that was true in the way bureaucracy uses truth. Enough of it to dull the edge. My part began after the universe had spoken. I checked identity marks, logged restraint integrity, signed the compressed terms, and sent men into a field wrapped around the black hole under us. Civilized space called that humane. We called it throughput. You still call it mercy? Granger asked. Step forward. That's what you people do. Put good names on bad rooms. I touched the reader to his collar and got the green line. Frame! He stepped into the white arch. From the deck, the Mercy Gate looked clean, which was the point. The frame was clinical, almost medical, fitted with restraint points and soft straps for men too damaged to stand. The field took hold, the sentence completed, and what came back was supposed to satisfy every legal obligation without giving the feeds anything they had to watch too closely. Sometimes there was enough left to ship to kin. Sometimes there was ash packed into a membrane tube. Sometimes there was less. Laura Kemp in medical once told me the prison's favourite trick was making even remains sound administrative. She said it without looking up from a body bag, and I laughed because men in my line laugh when they don't want to answer. Granger studied me through the frame. You ever wonder what it does to a man down there? Every officer who lasted past his first month wondered. After that, you learned which questions had to starve if you wanted to keep drawing pay. I had been on Mercy 6 years, long enough to know where not to look, long enough to let forms stand in for thought, long enough to mistake habit for a clean conscience. It ends, I said. He barked a laugh. That's the prayer, isn't it? I set my palm on the release plate. The frame sealed. The field took him. White light warped the deck lines around the arch and bent them inward as if the room itself had leaned too close. Then the frame stood empty again. Another completed sentence. Another file ready for closure. I turned to my console and signed the handoff. That was when Release Pod 3 came back early. Pods had a rhythm. Anyone who worked Mercy long enough learned it in the muscles, the way sailors learn weather through a hull. Pod 3 should have stayed dark another 7 minutes. Instead, its indicator washed from transit amber to occupied blue, and the carriage rose up the shaft with decon mist streaming off the shell. The bay officer beside me cursed under his breath. Granger's closure sheet was still open on my screen. Who's in 3? He asked. I checked the cycle log. The answer made no sense. Martin Crane, I said. The officer looked up sharply. Crane's a release at end of shift. He was. Nobody moved. Every guard on Mercy knew Martin Crane's file. Hijacked prison convoy, vented an escort ship to cover his escape. Civilian spillover in 3 sectors, the kind of number administrators liked to cite when budgets came up. He had gone into Mercy on a compressed sentence that should have outlasted nations. He should have come back dead. The pod docked, locks cycled, the door split. For one useless second, my mind searched for an ordinary explanation. Suit failure, protective wrap, some medical sheath over damaged tissue. Then Martin Crane stepped out, and his bare feet touched the deck. He had no skin. Everything that should have been hidden lay exposed beneath a clear, wet layer stretched from brow to heel. Muscle showed through in red and pearl, though whole sections had been pared back to reveal the pale shine of bone. His face kept its shape only because the structure beneath it remained. His lips were gone. His teeth sat exposed behind a moving membrane that flexed when he spoke. Transparent films slid over his eyes and back. Broken vessels had turned the whites a violent red. He walked under his own power. The closure sheet slid off my screen and hit the floor. Crane looked straight at me. "Moss," he said. The room snapped awake. Battens came up. Med alarms tripped. 2 men rushed the pod and stopped dead when they saw him still standing. Officers moved to bring him down. Crane lurched forward with both hands out. Not aggressive, almost desperate, as if he meant to catch me before I stepped off a ledge. "Stop the intake," he said. "Stop the new shipment before it descends." 2 officers hit him with shock batons. His body jerked. The clear sheath over his ribs quivered with the current. He stayed on his feet. "What intake?" I asked. "The outer hold transport. Don't let them bring it down." A second strike knocked him to one knee. Pink fluid threaded from the corner of his exposed mouth. He never took his eyes off me. "It's using them," he said. "It needs more structure. It's close." The bay officer slammed the baton into Crane's shoulder again. "Who is—" Crane drew a wet breath and answered with terrible calm. "The warden." I should have locked the wing down then, sealed the shaft, frozen track traffic, killed the intake window before approach confirmation could go out. Instead, I did what routine had trained me to do whenever the impossible arrived in uniformed space. I assumed the cause lived inside ordinary reach. Sentence trauma, field damage, illegal experiments in a lower level no one audited properly. Corruption, not transformation. Something small enough to report upward and survive. I ordered Crane moved to medical quarantine and called for Dr. Laura Kemp. Then, because the incoming transport from outer holding had already reached station approach and needed pre-clearance to hold its descent slot, I signed the authorization that kept the arrival window open. Crane saw me do it. He lunged with the speed of panic rather than strength. Officers dragged him down before he reached the console, but one hand caught my sleeve hard enough to leave blood on the fabric. "You just opened the door," he said. Laura met us in Isolation 2, wearing station scrubs under a pressure apron, exhaustion drawn into every line of her face. She had short, dark hair, pale lashes, and the kind of focus that made everyone in a room either defer to her or resent her. We had worked the same wing for 3 years, long enough to know each other's worst habits. She believed there was no administrative word clean enough to cover suffering. I believed there had to be, or the work would eat you alive. Neither of us had ever convinced the other. She stopped at the threshold when she saw Crane on the bed. "Keep the restraints on," she said. "I can still think," Crane said. "That isn't the concern." She woke the bedside scanner and drew the field over his chest. Light moved across the clear sheath stretched between his exposed ribs. Under it, vessels glowed in patterns no living anatomy should have supported. One of her aides said what all of us were thinking. He should be dead. Laura never looked away from the scan. Ordinary rules aren't running this. Deputy Warden Owen Callow arrived 2 minutes later with security at his back. Callow never hurried. He had a thick neck, silver at the temples, and the air of a man who believed gravity itself ought to stand at attention when he entered a room. His boots were still polished, in a prison where everyone else worked in scuffed soles. He took one look at Crane and did not startle. That was the first wrong thing about him. "What am I looking at?" he asked. "A live return," I said. "I can see that." Laura slid the scan aside. He's viable under a support layer grown directly over exposed tissue. Bone is intact through most major structures. Large portions of muscle remain. Large portions are gone. The sheath is biologically active. It's feeding him. It's maintaining pathways that should have collapsed. Callow stared at Crane with open disgust. Sentence trauma. Crane gave him an exposed-tooth smile. You know better. A small muscle tightened near Callow's eye, then went still. You'll answer questions when asked, Callow said. Crane ignored him and looked at me. How many are in the incoming run? I answered before I could stop myself. 52. Callow turned his head toward me. Just that. No words. The look hit harder. Crane closed his eyes for a second as if the number itself hurt him. Enough. Laura touched a pen light to one eye. The transparent lid slid across and back. It cost me effort not to step away. Martin, she said, tell me where you were after the cycle. He stared at the ceiling. It moved us in stages, he said. A man goes through the frame and thinks he's dying. He keeps thinking that for a long time. Then he learns dying isn't the work. The work starts after. It strips what it needs, keeps the rest alive, and shifts you lower. Some men become storage. Some become support. Some become nerve. Some become voice. Enough, Callow said. Crane turned his head toward him. Scared the doctor might hear something true? Callow stepped to the bedside. What did you see? Crane's teeth showed wider. What you've been feeding. Silence landed in the room. The aide at the wall stared at Callow. Laura's hand rested on the scanner housing but had stopped moving. I watched Callow in profile and saw something in him tighten further. You're damaged, he said. Trauma makes patterns out of pain. Crane looked back at me. Go below Mercy, past service access, past the old balance galleries, see where the returns go when the paperwork says disposal. How do you know my name? I asked. Because men down there still hear things. Men with ears left. Men fitted into walls. Men whose tongues got spared because something wanted our words. Laura took one measured step back from the bed. Callow's voice hardened. Transfer him to restricted care. Laura faced him. He is conscious, coherent, and presenting impossible survivability after an execution cycle. He stays here. He stays where command assigns him. You're not hearing me. I'm hearing exactly enough. I said, he knew about the transport before anyone told him. He used my name. Callow turned to me. Officer Moss, your job is security. Leave medicine to medicine and command to command. My job is custody, I said. That includes explaining how a man walks out of a release pod without skin. His stare held mine for 3 seconds. Long enough for a lesser officer to back down. He was counting on history. 6 years of me doing the practical thing. 6 years of understanding which objections a station could survive and which ones it punished. He wasn't wrong about the record. Just wrong about the next minute. He ordered 2 guards into the room and had Crane moved under armed watch to a locked bay deeper in medical. Laura argued until he threatened suspension. I said nothing further. Not because I agreed, because I wanted my badge active and my access live. Then I went to the return archive. People who write policy imagine prisons as finished structures. In practice, a prison is compromises stacked over emergency patches and blessed later as design. Rooms get repurposed. Locks change meaning. Temporary solutions become doctrine because nobody wants to reopen the cost of the first mistake. The return archive had once been a holding room for remains pending transfer. By the time I inherited Mercy Wing, it was a cold annex full of sealed drawers, most of them tagged complete and routed off to disposal channels no one on my shift ever physically watched. Laura met me there 20 minutes later, with a key strip she should not have had. You brought yourself into this, she said before I could speak. Open the drawer. We worked in silence at first. I pulled files. She checked med seals and chain logs. The room got uglier by the minute. Tags marked complete disposal sat on drawers that had never left the wing. Transport codes led to service corridors with no public map reference. Custody trails ended under Callow's override. The first drawer held Dennis Rourke. I remembered him because he had spent intake talking about fishing boats on Ganymede and crying when he signed kin refusal. I had walked him to Gate 4 myself. I had watched the White Arch take him. I had signed final completion with my own hand. He lay under a clear wrap fused directly to his body. No skin below the jaw. Shallow chest movement under a living sheath like cranes. Eyes open. Laura put 2 fingers to his neck. "Alive," she said. Rourke's gaze jerked toward her touch. His mouth opened. Most of the lower face had been cut back to bare bone and resealed. The sound that came out was only air moving through wet machinery that had once belonged to a man. I stepped away so fast my shoulder slammed into the drawer stack behind me. Laura called for a field stretcher on her wrist patch. "No," I said. She looked at me. "He can still be stabilized." "For what?" Her face tightened. "Because he's still a patient." The second drawer held a woman from a piracy case. Same sheath, same impossible life. The third held an empty wrap and restraint blood with a transfer tag routed to Service Gallery C. That was enough. Too many bodies would have turned the room into inventory. 3 made it personal. 3 made it undeniable. I checked the panel again. Authorizing seal, Deputy Warden. No cover story survived that line. Laura looked at me. There was no professional distance left between us. Only judgment. "How many?" she said quietly. "Have you signed through this wing and never once asked where the remains actually went?" I did not answer, because I knew the real one. I had asked a few times early on, then less. Then I stopped. You can live with almost any system if you learn to ask your questions at the point where someone else gets paid to answer them. That had been my trick. Not innocence. Delegation. Laura shut the drawer on Rourke. "I'm logging this and sending it off station. Callow will stop it. Let him try. If he gets warning first, he scrubs the roots and kills the feeds." She held my stare. "What are you proposing?" "We verify Service Gallery C. We get something he can't wash." She hated it on sight. So did I. But she had seen the same eyes in the same drawer. "You need someone who knows maintenance uglier than the public maps," she said. "Take Foster." Ray Foster met me outside old maintenance with a power lantern in one hand and a wrench in the other. He was 60, narrow as a pipe, and looked as though the station had cast him from the same alloy as its older walls. I knew him by reputation long before I knew him by name. Everyone on Mercy did. If a rail whined wrong or a cooling brace got stubborn, Foster fixed it and insulted the engineer who designed it. "Laura said you needed a door opened," he said. "More than one." When I told him the route code, something in his face closed. "Service Gallery C?" he said. "You got that from records?" "From bodies." He looked down the empty corridor. "I told them to weld that line shut." "Who's them?" "People who signed better than me." He scratched the scar at his neck and led me through a maintenance lock behind a coolant manifold, then down a lift spine no inmate ever saw. The lower we went, the more the station gave up the clean lie it showed above. White wall panels yielded to old metal patched over older ruptures. The deck sloped where it should have sat flat. Layers of repaint sat in tide marks, as though different years had leaned against the bulkheads and dried there. The farther we dropped, the less the structure obeyed its own design. Coolant pipes had been sleeved in clear tissue veined with dark lines. Anchor brackets vanished into pale calcified growth that had no business joining steel to steel. A service hatch stood open by 4 inches, though the indicator read sealed. Something inside clicked wetly when our lights crossed the gap. Ray saw me look and swung the lantern away. "Keep moving," he said. "How long has this been down here?" "Start small. Field artifact, they call it. Stress bloom. Matter drift. There's always a nice term for the first ugly thing." We reached Gallery C, though nothing still named it. The old stencil had been covered by a wash of clear tissue that shone under the lantern like a healed burn. My boots stuck for an instant with every step. "There," Ray said. A service arch stood ahead, sealed by an old manual wheel and 3 newer lock bars. One bar had been cut, another bent outward from force on the other side. The third still held, though the door around it had bowed. I set my badge to the reader. Denied. Ray grunted as if he had expected nothing else. He pulled a bypass line from his pouch, opened the panel under the reader, and bridged 2 contacts. The lock snapped. The chamber beyond had once been part of the Gravitic balance system. I knew that from placement training years before. Concentric platforms, tuning fins, control rails, shield housings. A room built to hold the prison steady over the black hole. It still did that. Something had simply grown around the old purpose and used it as a skeleton. Bone stood ribbed between support columns in great pale arcs. Some pieces were clean and white. Others still carried strips of tendon or red muscle under clear sealing membrane. Platforms that should have held calibration units now cradled linked spinal columns arranged in load-bearing curves. At the center of the room, hanging in the lens field above the floor, was a body under construction. A body assembled from human understanding and human waste. Its torso held too many ribs and no clean divide between chest and abdomen. The hips were too narrow for the mass above them. One arm hung complete to the hand, fingers flexing slowly around empty air as if testing their range. The head was only half finished. A skull base sat mounted under exposed supports, and a jaw built from sections that had once belonged to several different men opened and closed in small trial motions. Ray made a soft sound in his throat and stepped back. My light moved from the hanging shape to the chamber walls. Human remains had been fitted into them. A pair of eyes moved behind clear film in one recess. A forearm buried to the elbow in tissue growth twitched against a contact plate. A face fixed into the wall stared at us, with everything below the nose gone. The chamber had not merely stored them, it had incorporated them. The prison had become a workshop that learned from every subject it kept alive. A speaker grill near the floor crackled. "Nathan Moss," a voice said. The sound was wet and layered, as though several ruined throats had agreed on the same sentence only after argument. Ray backed into me. "Shut the door!" The hanging hand above us clenched. "Who are you?" I asked, because the question was easier than anything true. "I am what the sentence makes." The voice came stronger the second time, and I heard pieces of it inside itself. Old officers, intake commands, maybe even Owen Callow under the ruin. "I have learned your customs," it said. "Your ranks, your forms, your mercies." Ray turned for the door. The wall to our left unfolded. No seam showed until it moved. Then a white frame opened from inside the tissue-covered metal with a grace I knew too well. A mercy gate. Not installed, grown. "Run!" Ray got 2 steps. The field caught him at shoulder and hip and dragged him sideways into the frame. His lantern hit the deck and burst. I lunged, caught his hand and held him for half a breath. Then something in the field pulled harder than human structure could answer. His coverall ripped under my grip. His skin came with the frame. It kept him alive through the peel. That was the true obscenity of it. His face stayed turned toward me while the outer layer of him came away in one clean, wet pull and vanished into the light. His eyes stayed wide and wholly awake. His mouth opened around my name, but no sound escaped before the wall swallowed him. The gate folded shut. My voice came back from the chamber walls in broken scraps. Above me, the unfinished hand flexed again. I ran. The climb back lives in me as separate fragments, my shoulder smashing a pipe elbow and going numb, a hatch catching my shin and opening it to the bone through my trouser leg, a wrong turn into a dead-end room full of old shield housings wrapped in clear tissue sacks, a palm pressing from inside one of them against the film when my light crossed it. The smell of antiseptic and rot and hot metal. By the time upper maintenance spat me back into public station space, my badge had already tripped alarm for crossing restricted locks under duress. Security met me outside command. Callow was waiting. He sent the guards away with one glance and led me into his office above the shaft. Best view on the station, if a man liked looking down on an abyss before breakfast. The black center under Mercy Wing turned slowly in the observation glass like the eye of something asleep. I had Ray's blood on my sleeves. Callow looked at it, then at me. "So," he said, "you went below. You fed them to it." He moved around his desk and poured water into a glass. "Sit." I stayed standing. Callow drank, set the glass down and folded his hands. "The station almost died 7 years ago," he said. "Lens phase drift, containment cascade. 31 staff lost before we stabilized the rings. During the failure, the singularity field started responding in ways it was never built to respond. Gate timing changed. Pathways opened without command. Depth calculations began correcting themselves. Something emergent formed inside the system." "You mean it woke up?" "I mean it stopped behaving like equipment. You should have shut the prison down." "And sent what into the systems outside?" He leaned forward. "You know what this place is for. War criminals, colony burners, mass transport killers, bioweapon men nobody wants alive and nobody wants publicly executed. Mercy solved a political problem larger than either of us. You kept it running. I kept it from tearing itself apart. You fed people to it." His face hardened. "I stabilized it. There's no difference. There is when the alternative is structural failure with thousands in custody and a black hole prison coming apart around them." He pointed toward the shaft below us. "It needed organized neural matter. Human material held the field most effectively. When it got measured allotments, the drift stopped. The rings held. The gates behaved. Behaved. You've worked Mercy 6 years, Moss. Don't insult either of us by pretending your conscience woke up this morning." That hit because it landed true. He saw it land and pressed harder. "You told yourself the courts owned the violence. You told yourself procedure created distance. You told yourself compression was cleaner than old methods because you didn't have to watch. Fine. So did everyone. I simply looked further down the chain than the rest of you were willing to." He turned back to the glass, and it showed promise. There it was. Necessity had gotten him started. Curiosity had kept him there. "What did it show you?" I asked. "When the field thins, it projects probability, structural futures, failure trees, enough to hold this station one step ahead of collapse, enough to guide containment. You thought you had a leash. I had one until Crane came back too intact. The transport," I said. "Cancel descent." His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "That is no longer possible. You can close the track. You signed the pre-clearance. The vessel committed to station capture under lens influence. Break-off now would shear the hull." I moved for the comm console on his desk. Channel access flashed red under command lock. Callow touched something at his wrist. My badge went dead. The office door sealed. "I can still place you under detention," he said. "Help me contain this and perhaps we keep the damage where it belongs." "Where it belongs?" "Down there. With men already sentenced beyond any human measure." I threw the water glass in his face. It burst against his cheek. I came around the desk for the console. The door blew inward on emergency override, and 2 security men rushed me. I put one into the corner of the desk and drove an elbow into the other's ribs. Then Callow hit the shock grid under the floor, and white pain tore up through my legs hard enough to erase the room. I woke in a supply lock with my wrists bound behind a pipe bracket and blood dried in the corner of my mouth. Martin Crane sat on an overturned crate across from me. He looked worse than before. Parts of the sheath over his chest had split and resealed. One eye had gone cloudy at the edge. He still held himself upright by force alone. "You took your time," I said. "I had to lose the guard first." He cut my bindings with a maintenance saw so small it looked ridiculous in his flayed hand. "How did you get out?" He lifted his left wrist, where the restraint had torn through compromised tissue. Pain still buys things. I stood, my legs almost folded. Crane caught my elbow. His touch against my skin was warm and slick through the living membrane. He let go at once. "Laura?" I asked. "Alive when I left. Callow's got her under watch in Med." I steadied myself against the pipe. "The transport?" "Docking prep." He led me through stores and maintenance trunks that bypassed main security. He moved like a man who had learned the station from inside its nerves. The thought sickened me, but it got us where we needed to go. At one junction he stopped and leaned his forehead against the wall for 3 seconds. "How much of you is still you?" I asked. He opened his eyes. "Enough to hate Callow. A beat. Enough to hate you too. That helps. It should." His teeth showed. "You were there when they took my file and translated my life into schedule. Don't mistake this for forgiveness. I'm using you the way the place used me." We reached intake control above the lower dock and looked through the security glass. The prison carrier hung in the cradle with hull clamps locked. Ugly, practical, scarred by hard service. Through the inner corridor glass I could see the new shipment being marched off in pairs under armed escort. 52 in all. Murderers, bombers, war scavengers, traffickers, men the courts had condensed into a manifest. Still men. Crane saw the calculation in my face. "If you vent the dock now," he said, "they get 1 death." I turned to him. "The local override can dump atmosphere in 4 seconds. You stop the transfer, you starve it, and the body stays unfinished." "You're asking me to murder 52 bound prisoners." "I'm asking what kind of death you can bear being responsible for in the next 3 minutes." I looked back through the glass. One inmate stumbled on the ramp, and a guard hauled him upright by the collar. Another was so drugged, his knees barely worked. They had no idea what waited below the next lift. I had spent years hiding behind legal language and clean machinery. Crane was offering me no such shelter, just choice. "I can reroute them," I said. "Upper holding, manual lock. If they leave the descent path, it loses intake." Crane stared at me with exhausted fury. "You still think this place obeys doors? I'm not venting them." He closed his eyes for a second, then nodded once. "Then move." We hit the dock from opposite sides. I used Foster's maintenance band to trip the local routing grid, while Crane cut descent lift power at the service junction. Alarms erupted at once. Officers shouted. One of Callow's men spotted me and went for his sidearm. "Stand down," I said. "Mercy systems compromised. Redirect intake to upper hold." Nobody obeys a sentence like that in a prison unless rank or fear is already doing the work. Callow had spent years making sure both belonged to him. The first shot blew a chunk out of the rail near my head. After that, the dock became motion and bad choices. I dropped behind a cargo pallet, crawled to the nearest route stub, and forced a corridor change into the intake channel. 2 lift gates ahead of the prisoner line cycled towards standard holding instead of the Mercy shaft. For one bright second, I thought I had it. Then a white frame unfolded from the wall between the prisoners and the new route. A Mercy gate where no gate had ever been built. It opened like an eyelid. The first pair of inmates vanished into it before either they or their escorts understood what they were seeing. One guard fired point blank into the frame and lost his arm to the elbow when the field took the shot, and him with it. Another prisoner bolted for the opposite rail and hit a second frame that opened out of the deck itself. The dock dissolved into screams. Crane threw himself into the wall gate and jammed his half-flayed body across the threshold. The field bit into the sheath over his shoulder and stalled on living matter it could not strip cleanly. For a few seconds, the frame shuddered and held. "Move them!" His voice broke on the words. I vaulted the rail and ran straight into the prisoner line, slicing restraints as fast as my blade would let me. Men stumbled free in panic and scattered toward whatever space looked least white. Some fought the guards, some froze, some begged. One man smashed his cuffed hands into my mouth, thinking I was part of the same trap, and I let him because he had earned that much. A third gate flowered open behind the escort squad. That broke the line. One prisoner with restraint burns on both wrists sprinted for the freight lock. A frame opened around him from floor to ceiling. He hit the far side at a run, came back out through the same threshold half-stripped and shrieking, then collapsed clawing at muscle that should never have seen air. Above us, on the upper control walk, Callow appeared, barking orders that changed every few seconds. Hold the prisoners, seal the corridor, fall back from the frames, fire on Crane, fire on me. Authority had finally met something that did not care about rank. Crane cried out. The frame he was jamming surged brighter. The sheath over his chest tore from throat to belly. He looked across the dock at me. All the horror dropped away long enough for the man underneath to show in the pain. "It needs command," he shouted. "Badge, seal, chain of authority. That's how it carries itself past containment." Then the gate took him. Not cleanly, not mercifully. It pulled him through in savage jerks, tearing him apart along lines already marked by earlier work. The sound cut through every other sound in the bay. Shock had no room left in me. Function did. I ran for the upper walk. Callow saw me coming and fired twice. One round shattered the rail light behind me. The other sliced through my left sleeve and burned a line across the meat of my upper arm. We met at the control door hard enough to crack my teeth together. He was stronger than I had expected. Age had not softened him. Station life had compacted him. He drove me into the frame, got a hand at my throat, and tried to wrench me off balance. I hooked my wounded arm under his elbow and caught the command seal chain at his neck with my free hand. We went down together. The hand that had opened him had already changed. Bone tips had reshaped into locking prongs made for ports and latches. It had learned from every object it touched. "You maintain order," it said. I backed toward the primary cradle at the center of the room. White field housings ringed the platform. This was the old manual insertion frame for deep sentence binding, the kind of mechanism training still covered because every institution preserves the obsolete horrors it prays never to need. The warden kept coming. "You gave us names," it said. "Crimes, durations, mercy, warden." It savored the last title. I keyed the cradle with Callow's seal chain and my badge together. The console asked for condemned identity. There are moments when a life narrows so cleanly that choice becomes relief. I had spent the last hour trying to find a path that kept me both an officer and a man. There was none left. I had opened the intake window. I had refused the vent. I had spent years helping this place translate bodies into process until the process learned appetite from us. The prison still had one honest function. It could sentence a man and make the sentence hold. I entered my own name. Nathan Moss, authority basis required. I laid Callow's broken seal on the plate and pressed my bleeding palm over it. Manual condemnation accepted. The warden crossed the outer ring of the cradle. The housings woke one by one, casting hard white bars across the chamber. It moved fast. I snatched the calcified shard from my pocket, the piece I had taken from Crane in isolation when the sheath had sloughed loose under restraint, and drove it into the release track on the cradle lever. The warden's hand closed on my arm. Pain went bright and exact. Bone prongs punched through sleeve and flesh together. I drove the lever down with my other hand. The primary mercy gate rose around us. This frame was larger than the wing gates, thicker through the supports, built for full core insertion, when human authority had to bind a process in person. White light bent around the edges. The floor seemed to fall away into it. The warden hauled me toward its chest, trying to drag my badge, my blood, my live command identity closer to whatever it used for a heart. Its face came inches from mine. Under the stretched tissue I saw pieces of men, a cheekbone set too high, teeth from more than one jaw, a strip of grey scalp rooted near the crown. It had built itself from the sentenced and the staff alike. It had learned command from the men who ran the place. "Nathan Moss," it said, and Martin Crane lived inside the voice. That nearly broke me. Then the field took hold. Everything Mercy had ever done above deck was built to hide process, clean frame, clean light, sentence complete. Inside the primary cradle there was nowhere to hide from the work. The field seized every layer separately. Pressure came first, driving bone into bone, then heat without flame, then time stretching sideways so far a second became territory. The warden convulsed beside me, and in that field I saw its truth too clearly. It had never been one body. It was an agreement among stolen parts held together by lens force, punishment logic, and hunger. The sentence drove into those agreements and pried them apart. Bone sections slipped. Joined spines unmade themselves. Awareness lodged inside the framework woke one by one and began screaming through the structure. It tried to get into me through the command pathways. I felt it in the badge, the seal plate, every obedient thread a prison uses to decide who gives orders and who receives them. I kept my hand on the lever. My own body opened by degrees. The wound in my arm disappeared inside a wider pain as outer layers began to go. A clear support sheath grew over exposed surfaces to keep me functional, just as it had with Crane, with Rourke, with all the others. Mercy had always required a living subject to bind a full sentence properly. For the first time in my years on the wing, I understood the place exactly as the condemned had. It did not end people, it used them. The shard from Crane held in the release track. The lever stayed down. Outside the frame, through the bending light, I saw the emergency packet fire from the far side of the station and kick into dark. Good. Someone would know. The warden's face turned toward me inside the field. It was coming apart now. Under the ripping sheath, mouths opened where mouths had no right to be. One said Callow's name. One begged. One recited an intake number. One, I think, was Ray Foster asking if the pumps had been shut before final lock. I kept my hand on the lever. The field deepened. Pain remains pain. Time under compression becomes something crueler. Material. Every moment a room you have to cross on your knees. I crossed many. I do not know how many. In one, the warden still fought. In another, most of its frame had come apart into spinning sections held under sentence. In another, I could no longer feel my legs below the knees because the support sheath had replaced too much of me with function. The men I had processed came back to me then, not as ghosts or visions, but as memory sharpened by guilt into company. Granger in the frame asking whether I still called it mercy. Rourke talking about fishing boats. Crane on the dock telling me to decide what kind of death I could live with. He had been right. I had hidden behind forms for years. Hidden behind law, behind distance, behind words that turned suffering into policy. My refusal on the dock had fed the thing one more time. That knowledge stayed with me through every stretched room after. At some point, the warden stopped sounding like one speaker and became a ruin of separate men. The sentence had found the seams inside it and widened them until nothing coherent remained. That was the end of its ambition, if not yet the end of its matter. Mine took longer. I do not know whether the station sank fully into quarantine at once, or whether systems ran above me for a while first. I do not know whether Laura died in med or reached a shell and chose vacuum over being used. I hope she got a choice. Hope was the only currency left to me by then. The sheath crept over my chest as the field continued its work. Breathing changed, speech changed, pain changed shape until it stopped feeling like an event and became the texture of time. I stayed at the lever because any easing in my hand might have freed the track, and if the track freed, the primary frame could open before the sentence locked to full depth. I had supervised hundreds of men through Mercy, and never once stood where they stood. The prison taught me too late what I had been part of. Toward the end, if there was an end, the room lost its edges. White bars became lines without distance. The black center below the station drew near in some sense that had nothing to do with space. I thought of my first week on Mercy Wing, of the older officer who had told me to keep my eyes on the people and off the shaft. Good advice in one sense. Bad advice too. It had taught me to watch the bodies and ignore the system shaping them. The last clear thing I remember is the lever under my hand and the knowledge that it had stayed down. I entered the prison as staff. I finished in it as the last sentenced man.